Hello everyone, I'm neuralsyn and welcome back to another episode where we're taking a look at the auto-crafting dropper functionality in NemBomb's carpet mod. Now, recently in my comments someone left me the suggestion to do an auto-crafter for the sea lantern, and so that's going to be the focus of today's video. If we look at it, the top row of the crafting recipe is an alternating pattern. The middle row is a repeating pattern, and then we have the top row effectively duplicated in the bottom where it's an alternating pattern. And this is a crafting format that we have yet to see. Fortunately, we can use a lot of the same pulse techniques that we've used in previous contraptions, with one new one that I'm going to show you in a moment. So let's get into it. The first thing that we want to do is try to get that top row. And so we need a prismarine shard, we need a crystal, and then we need a shard. And to do that, what we're going to do is take the pulse from our trigger device and wire up 2 droppers, observe that, and power that, and connect that with a powered rail. And what we're missing here is the crafting table. And so this is going to work, and this is going to give us our top row. So when the contraption is turned on, the note block is powered, which is going to power our shard dropper, which will then be picked up by this observer here, powering the powered rail, which is detected by this observer here, which is directly powering our prismarine crystal dropper, which will go 2 spaces. So what we need is our auto-crafting dropper, and then one more dropper just connecting it so that the crystal can get into the recipe. And that is how this works. Now, it's easy to miss, but that really only covers the first 2 items. It doesn't give us our last item. And if we take a look at this setup here, we have an observer going into 2 droppers. So let's take a look at that setup over here. So if we put a similar setup where we have 2 droppers, an observer on top, we'll put some ingredients. So in this case, we'll put some crystals on the top, some shards on the bottom. What happens when you have a setup like this and you power the observer, or rather you trigger the observer, which powers the droppers, you notice they both spit out an item. And so that's actually the trick that we're using here to get that last set. So we get our first shard from this dropper here, and then we get the rest of it by this observer firing and triggering the dropper tower here. And that will give us, if we turn this on, our top row. Now we need to work on getting the middle row, which is simply 3 repeated. We've seen that before in at least 2 of the contraptions that we've built. I'm going to use the lamp design. And as always, I'm going to look for where in the circuitry we can take a pulse from. In this case, the last thing that happens is this observer at the top fires, so that's where I'm going to continue the device. And I'm going to build up the standard lamp setup that we've used before. Throw in the dropper, and because it's being directly powered, we need one more space. And that needs to be powered. So when the top row is complete, this observer is going to pick it up, power this powered rail, which will be picked up by this observer, which is directly powering our second prismarine crystal dropper, which will push the block 2 spaces. That'll give us this spot here. The observer here will fire, triggering the lamp, which is picked up by the observer, which is again directly powering this dropper, which will give us the second spot right here. And then the lamp's going to turn off and we get our third. So if we go ahead and do all of that, we can see that we now have the first 2 rows ready to go. The last row is simply a repeat of the first row, and instead of creating a new set of droppers to feed us those ingredients, we're going to actually try to make use of the 2 droppers that we've already set up. To do that, we are going to extend from our initial trigger pulse, set up a long delay. And the first thing we want is a shard. So we can get that by indirectly powering this dropper here. You can see that once these two repeaters fire, it powers this block, which is going to trigger the rail, which will trigger these observers powering the block that powers the dropper that contains the shard. That gives us our first spot. And then we can take the same line and directly power the dropper that contains our crystals, which will give us the second spot. And when this turns off, this bottom row here is going to fire again, which gives us our last spot. And so with that simple adjustment, we can see that we now have the full crafting recipe. So the last thing to do to make it an autocrafter is to actually trigger the craft. Again, looking at our chain, the last thing that happens is that this row is going to fire. So we're going to take a pulse off of that, add a little bit of delay, come down, move over, and this is our auto-crafting dropper. So that's the thing we want to power. So we'll just put a block there so that it only powers and it doesn't spit out the ingredient. And as simple as that, when we turn this thing on, out pops a sea lantern. So we have our auto-crafter in place. Now let's make it continuous. So towards the end of the processing in the circuitry here, we can take pulse off of this observer. And while the last row is filling in, we can introduce some delay. So let's go ahead and do that. We can just do 8 ticks of delay there and power the block. And this is what I did in my previous episode where I showed how to make things continuous. All I'm doing here is just re-triggering the full loop, the full circuitry cycle. So when we turn it on now, you can see that we have continuous production of sea lanterns. Take a look in here. And that's it. It's just that simple. Hopefully you learned something today. Thank you for the suggestion. As always, hit the like button, subscribe, and if you have any more suggestions, please let me know. Thanks again, and see ya.